Hello, I'm Joel Woodruff, president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and today we're fortunate to be able to look at a very important topic. It's the impact of technology on the Christian life with Tony Reinke. Now, for those who are not familiar with the C.S. Lewis Institute, the Institute was founded 47 years ago as a servant ministry to the church for the purpose of helping develop disciples of Jesus Christ who articulate, defend, share, and live their faith in personal and public life. Our Heart and Mind Discipleship Ministry now has 17 locations in the U.S., Canada, and Northern Ireland, and people around the world download and use the small group resources, articles, audio and video materials like this one, and podcasts through our award-winning website. Thousands of men and women have also participated in our year-long, tuition-free C.S. Lewis Fellows program. Now, this program equips people to be competent and confident in their faith in Jesus Christ, so they become multipliers for the faith, making disciples through their work, their church, and their family life. To see if there's a Fellows program in your city, I encourage you to go to our website and click on Fellows Program. There also will be a link in the chat room of this broadcast. The application for the Fellows program will open on February 1st, with the new class beginning in late May and early June. For more information on any other CSLI programs, I encourage you to go to our website and subscribe to receive our free digital discipleship resources and announcements about upcoming CSLI events like this one by going to Get Updates under the About tab on our website. Now, please join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity we have through technology to be able to come together to discuss the impact of technology in our spiritual lives and on the Christian life. And we pray now that you would guide my discussion with Tony. Thank you for him. I pray your blessing on Tony's work and his family and ministry. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce Tony Reinke. Tony's an author, nonprofit journalist, the senior teacher for Desiring God, and produces and hosts John Piper's podcast, Ask Pastor John, which is dedicated to questions of Christian theology and ethics. The bulk of his work centers on how we best flourish in this technological age as we're saturated by innovation, media, and enough on-demand video to fill our eyes for 100 lifetimes. He's the author of numerous books, including 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, and one of his latest, this one, God, Technology, and the Christian Life. Tony, thank you for joining us as we look at the impact of technology on the Christian life.
It's my honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Tony, I was wondering if you'd first share with us a little bit about your own spiritual journey and how you became interested in thinking and writing about the intersection of faith and technology.
Yeah, I came to faith late, 21 years old. I would consider late. I grew up in a Christian home, but I didn't come to faith until after I was married. And so kind of a long backstory to that. But I was a good kid. I was an obedient kid. I got decent grades. I went to church every Sunday. My wife, when we got married, same thing. We're both the good kids from our families, and we got married. And about a year after marriage, we both realized that we were the Pharisee in the parable, the Pharisee and the tax collector. We were basing our hope of eternal life on our own self-righteousness, and that broke us. That really shattered us when we heard a sermon on that text and came to realize that we were the Pharisees, and we needed to cry out, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And my wife and I both cried that prayer on the same Sunday morning at the same church service, sitting right next to each other. It's an amazing experience to be saved with a spouse. I don't encourage people to marry someone who doesn't know if they're in Christ, but if you are unbelievers, to be saved in the same morning by the same sermon at the same moment is just something that's priceless. And so I was a journalist. Growing up, I knew by about fifth grade I wanted to be a writer. By about middle school, I knew that was going to be in journalism, and I pursued that ruthlessly throughout high school. I worked every job I could find, not only for the high school paper, but also for the local daily newspaper in the area. I grew up in Nebraska, so the Omaha World Herald was kind of like the big newspaper in the area. I started to write sports for them. That led to another job, and it just I just fell in love with sports journalism. That was going to be my life. I was going to become a baseball historian eventually and write books about baseball history. And so got to college, did 2 years, blew through every journalism course at the University of Nebraska, and then lost all interest in school because I didn't want to take any other classes besides journalism. And I was having so much fun traveling all over the place, covering sports teams. And it was at the time I graduated high school in 95, so 96, 97, around 98, newspapers just started to collapse with the rise of the web. And so these websites were coming up, just taking out daily papers, and journalists were losing their jobs every day. Newspapers were merging. So everything looked pretty ominous. So my third year of college, I dropped out and just went back into the family business, which is construction. And I just figured, well, I could support a family that way. And I knew I wanted to be married. And so got married. And then a year later, after we were married, we got saved. And what happened was all of those earlier desires to read and to write and to do journalism came back, but with a heart to serve the church with that gift. And so it took me several years to figure out like what was God doing with that background in journalism and this love for the church. But eventually it became obvious that he was calling me to be a journalist of Christian ethics. And so I started to pursue that, and that opened doors in ministry. It's a pretty unique skill set to be a journalist with a theological interest, and so that led to open doors in a denomination in the DC area, and then that led to doors to working at Desiring God and working with John Piper, where I've been for about 13 years now. And so in 2013, 2014, I started to see that technology, specifically social media and smartphones, was going to be one of those ethical areas where we needed thinkers. We needed people on that. And so I decided to throw my hat in that arena, did a lot of early interviews with ethicists, did a lot of early exegetical work in that field of just trying to figure out what should we think of smartphones, iPhones, social media, and things like that. And that opened doors, started to see a good response online from people looking at the resources. And then that led to a book deal with Crossway, and that became a book called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, which that kind of just took off. And then I just kept pursuing different aspects of tech and media. I wrote a book on mass media called Competing Spectacles. And then I stepped way back and just wrote a macro perspective book on technology called God, Technology, and the Christian Life. That's the book that you held up. That's my most recent one. And so I've just continued to press into starting with social media, then mass media, and now AI, robotics, nuclear power, things like that. Just kept pressing into those issues because I just didn't see many people writing on it or thinking about it, and saw a real need in the church. And so I've been doing that ever since.
Wow. Well, thank you, Tony. First of all, sharing your story. What a wonderful story to hear how you and your wife came to faith in Christ at the same time, and then how God's led you on this journey, and as he often does, takes those giftings and desires and interests that he's placed within us and uses them for all kinds of wonderful things. And I sure appreciate your work in thinking about this topic, especially as thinking in the church. It's an area that it has been underexplored. As we jump into this topic, definitions are important. I wonder if you might first define for us perhaps the word technology and what that means in today's age.
It's applied technique. So it's an art, it's a science, it is a way of engaging with God's creation in a way to coerce it or move it or change it or perfect it or beautify it or do something with it using technique. And so I don't see a huge distinction between the tool and technique dichotomy, which is what some historians will see. I think tools and technologies kind of all blend into this long history of technology that goes to space travel and begins with the creation of hammers. So I think of it as one long trajectory, one long story of applied technique. And I think when you look at the story of David and Goliath, for example, in the Old Testament, you see a face-off between two technologists. Goliath was more like RoboCop, covered head to toe with metal, like the greatest technologically outfitted human on the planet, which he'd plundered all these different metal things from different nations and then hung them on himself. So he was this pinnacle of technological superiority. But David was not techless either he had a sling, he was a sniper, and he knew going in on a one-on-one combat mission that being a sniper is strategically pretty smart. So you don't have you don't have a technologist and an anti-technologist. You have two guys using technology, different kinds of technologies in a one-on-one battle. And David proves to be the superior technologist. He proves to be the superior. He has the superior technique. The technique is so small, so tiny, that whip, that sling puts the focus on God and His providence over the whole thing. But nevertheless, he knew how physics worked. He knew how to kill with basically as a sniper. And so that's kind of one of the first stories we see what I would call technologists in the Bible. They're both using technology. They're both using techniques to a certain end.
That's a great story to bring up in regards to technology. Would ever have thought about that in that way, and I think helps us frame this a little bit. As far as technology going all the way back to Stone Age and Iron Age, and then today, do you think that in the 20th and 21st century that technology expansion has been more rapid than other times in history, or do you think it's just more of a perspective in that regard?
It feels more rapid, but in some senses is not. In some senses, if you're tracking the unfolding of digital technologies, digital tools, websites, and apps, and things like that, it does feel very rapid. But in other ways, when you look at technology, it also feels very slow. Like the air conditioner that I use in Phoenix, which I need to live in Phoenix, is basically the same technology that's been around since the 1950s, late 1950s. I mean, it really hasn't improved much since then. And so there are certain technologies that seem like, wow, it's just radically, everything's changing. And there's other areas where you realize that we're actually still using older technologies that I think could be improved, made more efficient and things. So it depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at Silicon Valley apps, gadgets, wow, digital photography, electric vehicles, those things, a lot of things have changed, but in a lot of sense, there's been such a focus on the digital, on electric, that there's so many other fields that have just stalled. And so I think there's just different ways to look at it.
No, that's a good point. I suppose it depends where people are focusing at any given time in history as far as what is developed. Yeah. It's interesting. I know one thing I think that at least I've picked up around here with artificial intelligence, with cameras everywhere, smartphones everywhere, there is some thought that technology maybe is getting to the point, kind of like those sci-fi books, where it begins to dehumanize the world. In other words, human beings seem to have less importance. There's even this idea that machines are going to take over the world. Do you think technology can be dehumanizing? And what do you think about that idea?
Oh, it definitely can be dehumanizing. I mean, AI is one of those examples of things that if you're not careful with, it does shape and form the way you think of what it means to be a human. And AI has a lot of potential benefits in personal productivity, in national defense, in medicine, in law. I think there's a lot of ways that AI will eventually be useful in our lives, but there's a sense in which that whole technology is built from a transhumanistic worldview. This idea, as Elon Musk would say, we are brains in a vat. That's all that we are. And everything that we feel, see, touch, that's all just feeling. It's just a kind of a mirage. Of course, he believes that we live in a simulator designed by a super intelligence. That's a whole nother conversation. But the idea that AI is built from this post-humanist worldview, and that is that what you are is basically your consciousness. So just your thoughts are who you are. And everything else is biological, everything else that gets viruses, that gets broken bones, that gets sick, that gets viruses, that has to go to the bathroom, that has to go to the hospital, that will eventually die. All of that biological biohazard baggage, we can do away with that. And what we have left is the consciousness. That's who you are, your consciousness. And of course, C.S. Lewis himself dealt with this in That Hideous Strength, which is one of his great books, just hammering away at this transhumanist movement that he saw coming right after World War II. It's just amazing how early he saw this coming on. But yeah, there's this idea that I'm going to use AI so that I can think faster. I'm going to plug my brain into a Neuralink so that I can be interfaced with a computer. Then I can think faster. Then my consciousness could maybe be exhumed from this biological biohazard of a body and can be put in the cloud. And so someday I can live this eternal existence as pure consciousness in the cloud. That's kind of one of the transhumanist goals, to make people live forever, is to make that consciousness a digital thing that can live forever. Well, as we know from the Bible, from birth to baptism to the Lord's table to the resurrection from the dead, we are more than just a conscious being. We have this body that God has given us that frames what he expects from us. We're gendered. We have different races. We have all these different aspects to our bodies that come into play that define who we fundamentally are. And so that AI trajectory that just says you're just this human consciousness, let's make that consciousness faster, sharper, quicker, is all built on that transhumanist ideology. Transgenderism comes out of that transhumanism, but you can see how that dominates and drives everything. So there are benefits to the technologies, but you're exactly right. They can dehumanize us if we begin to think that consciousness is basically what we are. No soul, no body, just consciousness. And it's more complex than that.
Yes. So the transhumanist perspective, obviously the view of humankind is quite different than a biblical view. How would you, what do you see God's perspective being when it comes to technology? How does God view technology in our world today?
Whoa. Okay, that's a huge question. I would only write a 300-page book if it took 300 pages to explain, and it really does. From Genesis to Revelation, what we see in the Bible is a story of God giving us his creation and then giving us creativity and giving us innovators to engage in that creation, to make things, to make new shiny things. And then to take those new shiny things and to love him with them, to love others with them, and to glorify him for all the gifts he's given us. Now, what makes it so challenging is that for about the past 100 years, the default position of the church has been tech pessimism. It's been Luddism. It's been an anti-technology dystopian approach that just says we don't need technology. It's more holy just to reject technology. Any new fangled thing that humans invent, let's thumbs down on it, and that's holy, that's godly. And so we're living with about 100 years of that buildup, I think, since around World War I, when we started to see the power of our inventions to kill others at scale. I think that caused a lot of people to step back and wonder what Christians should think about all of this. But I think there's very good biblical foundations from Genesis to Revelation that would say, instead of just taking a Luddite perspective on these things, we can actually see God's glory in the innovations that we're making. And that's the case I try to make in this new book, going from about 20 different texts in the Bible. You put them all together to show this point. But it's fairly complex, and it's complex in the sense that these fundamental priorities that you need to really see God's glory and generosity in the technologies that we use every day have so fallen by the wayside that they need to be recovered. They need to be brought back into the foreground of the church's consciousness. And it's just not there right now. So it really is starting with a sort of a blank slate and sort of working through text by text to build a vision of technology that is, I believe, more God-centered and more balanced. It sees the dangers of things like transhumanism, but also sees the benefits of the 10,000 technologies that we use every single day that we don't give God glory for. And so I think that's a concern that I've tried to correct.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great. Well, you talked about kind of this idea of the kind of a downer on technology in the Christian circles, and you even think of certain groups, not critiquing anyone, but the Amish or different groups, even pick certain technologies you can use, others can't. I'm sure that applies throughout all different denominations. What would you say are some of maybe the myths or the misnomers that Christians have about technology, that some of these things that have produced this idea in the past 100 years?
Yeah. So in my book, I lay out the 12 myths that I think are pervasive within the church. And I had heard these as I started traveling around talking about smartphones and social media. I was warning of the concerns there. And I was hearing from parents, from pastors, from theologians, a response to that was like, yeah, let's just dismiss it. Let's just throw away the iPhone. And so I started to just make a list in those early travels of sort of the myths that I was hearing, the sort of easy fixes that aren't really fixes. And and that became really the basis for the new book on technology. And so there's many different myths. I think one of the most common myths is this idea that sort of God gave us a creation and we're just supposed to live on it like as a garden. We're just supposed to look, don't touch, like, bulls in a china shop, like don't touch anything. This place is made of glass. So if you see, tar bubbling up from the sand in the Middle East, look at it, but don't touch it. Definitely don't siphon it and refine it and make fossil fuels. If you see uranium, just like stand back and look at it. Definitely don't take it, refine it, and create nuclear power. If you see nuclear fusion reaction happening on the sun, stand back and just adore it, but don't try to do that. And so it leads to this perspective of technology where even though this globe is loaded with potential, with power, with material possibilities, we're just supposed to look at it and live in a garden-like sort of agrarian type approach. And I just think that is one of the myths I think has driven this tech pessimism in the church for the past 100 years. Whereas I think what creation is this place that's full of glory. It's full of all sorts of materials. It's full of 60 elements that we can take out of the ground, refine, and put into a smartphone. Like the smartphone, we don't make smartphones ex nihilo. We make smartphones out of the things that God has given us to make with and the powers he's given us. We're using electricity right now. If somebody's listening to us, watching us right now, they're using electricity. Where did electricity come from? We didn't invent it. God invented it, put it into his creation in the lightning bolt. And it took a long time, but at some point, a guy in Boston was like, I think that thing shooting out of the sky is the same thing that when I, touch you and zap you with a little shock, I think it's the same thing. I think it's electricity. And of course, the Brits laughed at Ben Franklin and said, "You're ridiculous. That's not electricity. That's some fire in the sky that can coexist with water. We don't know what it is, but it's a fire and water mix somehow in the heavens." And Franklin was like, "No, I think this is electricity." And so he put his kite up in the sky and put his knuckle to the key and proved to the world that God invented electricity. And here we are using EVs, batteries, power coming through our walls, through our batteries. We're using all of this electrical technology, and it is all a gift from God. He gave us electricity as a power source to harness and then to use. As a huge backstory, because what Ben Franklin did is he created a huge theological debate in the church, which was, are we supposed to harness the lightning, or is the lightning just God's providence speaking to us? And so it would take a long time to sort of fill out that story, which is a fascinating story. But the bottom line is we have electricity because God invented electricity, put electricity into his creation, and then he taught us how to capture it. And that's what we've done. And so I think just as you look at more and more of the resources of this creation, the potential powers that God has put into it, all the things that we can make and all the things we can't make, there's way more things that we think we can make that we can't, that won't work. When you look at the number of startups in Silicon Valley, 95% of them will fail in the first 5 years. When you look at patents, I think 98% of US patents, which I think it costs like $10,000 now to file a patent, about 97% of US patents will never make a penny of profit. So the number of things that we can actually invent and actually cause to be fruitful is very small. And so there are all sorts of limiters in place that God has put, not only natural laws, but also economic factors and other factors that limit what we can make. So we have this expansive place where we can go, this playground of materials and powers, and those are constrained by many different things. But I think in the end, that's what I want Christians to see, is not creation as this huge garden but as a playground that God has given us to go and to invent and to create and to glorify him in the inventions that we use every single day.
Oh, that's a great analogy. And I think it's interesting. I think in the scientific world, of course, you have the misnomer that most scientists are atheists. I know that I think over 50% of physicists have some kind of theistic worldview, but there has been this tendency to view the world as and science as being outside of the religious circles, and yet it's this very understanding of a creator who created the world and natural laws and things that God put in place that allowed modern science, I think, to come about. Would you want to say a little bit more about that and how that impacts technology?
Yeah, I would love to write another book and just talk about the Christians in science over the years, because there are some amazing minds who are like, a Baptist preacher on the weekends and then doing electricity innovation during the week. In fact, there's a really fascinating story. Oh, I forget his name now. Ben Franklin had a next door neighbor who was a Baptist preacher, and he lost his job. He lost his pastorate. And Ben Franklin said, well, why don't you take all these trinkets that I'm doing, like these cool shock things. You put people in a circle and one of them touches the battery and you shock the whole line, and it's spectacles. He said, why don't you just go around the country doing this? And so he did. And so one of the first guys running around was in New England was Ben Franklin's next door neighbor who was looking for a job. And he was like, why don't you just go do these spectacles? And he was like, I can do that. And so, but there's a lot of Christians play, from Dr. Collins in tracking down the genome and spilling it out for the world to see. Christians have been behind a number of really important technological advances and breakthroughs. My argument in the book is that I don't actually need to follow that line of thinking to show you that God has filled the world with innovators. And I can show that from Genesis chapter 4 in tracing out Cain's lineage. So you have Cain and Abel, two brothers. Cain kills his brother, right, in cold-blooded murder. This is the first death of a human in the first creation. This is cold-blooded murder. This is premeditated. Maybe he used a farming tool to kill his brother. We don't know. But Cain is now marked as like this guy he's a thug. He is a murderous thug. And so what should happen to him? According to the law that comes later, if you shed a man's blood in a field, your blood should be shed as well. And so Cain is primed to be executed. God should send down vengeance on Cain and judge him. And instead, what God does is he says, I'm going to put a mark on Cain. Don't touch him. Don't beat him up. Don't execute him. Don't hurt him. I'm going to protect his life. And the reason why God is going to protect his life is because he's going to protect the lineage of the progeny that's going to come out of Cain's story. And so the industries of cattle breeding, what amounts to early genetics, trying to figure out how to raise different types of animals to make them strong, the music industry, and then all metalworking, those three industries, cattle ranching, music making, metallurgy. Those three industries will all come from Cain's great grandchildren. We see that in Genesis chapter 4. So I think already from page 2 or 3, we see that God has a story for human innovation that is not exactly the story of his church. He's going to use Cain's rebellious lineage to introduce into the world innovators that are going to change how we think of industry, how we think of cattle herding, how we think of genetics, how we think of metallurgy, how we think of music making. And that's all going to come through Cain's lineage. So I think that already sets the stage for what we read later in like Isaiah 27, where, how does the farmer know how to raise crops? Well, the reason the farmer knows how to raise crops is because his God, the creator, is teaching him how to do it with the techniques of how to plant, how to harvest. All of those techniques God is teaching the farmer in Isaiah 28. That is an amazing text to read. And then, of course, you come to, I think, the most mind-rattling verse in the whole Bible on technology, and that's Isaiah 54:16. That is a verse that you have to take slowly. You have to take it in reverently. It is a it is a lot to take in. But right there, what God is saying is he is going to create the creators of war weapons. He's not talking about Christians, believers, nation of Israel. He's talking about war weapons makers will be the product of his ingenuity. He makes the innovators that makes the innovations that shape the future. And that's one of the way that God communicates to his people. Hey, I'm in charge. I'm in charge of the future. You know why I'm in charge of the future? Because I create Elon Musk, because I create Steve Jobs, because I create the innovators in the world. They don't have to be Christians to come under my reign. I am the one who creates the creators. And this is one of the fascinating things that you see in the Bible, is that the reason why a nation would have a lot of innovators is because God has blessed or cursed that nation with a lot of innovators. God is the one who is at the lever of controlling the volume of innovators in any given culture at any given time. And so I don't think we have to go and try and search out like, oh, there's a Christian in Silicon Valley making a new app, therefore that app is better than all the other apps. I don't think we have to do that. I think God has a place and a plan in his story to use rebellious sinners who will make new innovations that God is going to leverage for his glory, hack for his glory, or otherwise show his generosity in them. And so that whole, I want to sort of get in front of that line of thinking of saying, well, we can trust that technology if a Christian made it, but if a non-Christian made it, then we can't trust it. Now we have to be discerning, but we also need to see throughout that storyline of scripture that God has a place to show us that some of these amazing industries that we still rely on today, cattle breeding, music making, metallurgy, all those industries we can trace back to the forefathers of those industries, which were Cain's great, great, great grandsons. And so we have to appreciate that. And the Bible wants us to appreciate that. So for some reason, and I can't explain why, God has a redemptive storyline that takes center stage in the Bible. And within it, he records an innovative storyline from Genesis to Revelation. We see that in city building, in technology making. That's a theme that's going to run all throughout Genesis to Revelation.
Oh, that's powerful. And I think important to again, just to see God's really blessing on all humanity and working through all peoples, whether believer or not. He is in control and working through them. And that sense of God's general beneficence upon all creation and helping giving every human being has a potential to create and to develop perhaps new technology that could be a blessing to humanity. I think it's a good word for believers too to think about that. Too often we tend to segregate, and that's not a good thing. So thank you for that thought. So there are these very positive benefits of technology going on, and you see it in humanity that God created us to develop and apply techniques and technology. However, there are, I think in our world today, a lot of concerns. What do you say the possible downsides of technology in general? What if you were to look at the danger zones? What would those look like?
Yeah, the danger with technology, going back to Psalm 20, is that we will put our hope in the technology to save us and deliver us. And so if your life is one that you say, I don't need God, I've got my smartphone, I've got medical innovation in a hospital that's 5 minutes away from me. So I don't need God because I've got all these technologies around me that sort of bolster my life. And I think that's where most Americans would be. They just feel so secure. They have an insulated home with heating and air conditioning, and there's a military that keeps them safe. And most diseases we can wipe out pretty easily. Most medical challenges can be dealt with in an ER. We have all of these things that are, we just lean on them. We put our hope in them. They won't let us down until they do. And so I think, all the way back in Psalm 20 and throughout the entire Bible, we're seeing this, is that the problem with humans is that we take our technologies and instead of glorifying God for them, we make gods of them. and we say this is our salvation. And this goes back to the transhumanism, like who's going to save us? A couple of lab geeks in lab coats in Silicon Valley are going to save us because they're going to somehow exhume this mental faculty out of us so that we can live forever. So we put our hope and trust in Silicon Valley. We put our hope and trust in the makers of technologies to be our savior and our deliverer. That's always the problem. And so the challenge is, this is a challenge for everyone. In the Old Testament, this is a challenge for all the nations. This is a challenge for God's own nation in Deuteronomy chapter 8. So we read, Moses is getting his people, God's people, ready to enter the promised land. And one of the things he says in Deuteronomy 8:9 is that land is going to be flowing with milk and honey. That's sort of the moniker that we read about the land flowing with milk and honey is sort of the promised land's name. Milk and honey, lots of milk, lots of honey. But we don't typically hear is that it's also a land flowing with iron and copper. And that's what Deuteronomy 8:9 talks about. Like there's a material capacity within the promised land that as the nation of Israel finds that iron and finds that copper and finds ways to mix and match and make tin and things like that, they're going to create a whole industry of new tools. And God says, when you start doing that, when you make these cities and you make this economy and you make all of these things prosper, don't forget to glorify me in it, or you're going to be just like all the other nations. So that's the challenge with our technologies. It's, do we see God's generosity in it, or do we not see his generosity in it? And that is a challenge for everyone who lives in Silicon Valley. That's a challenge for everyone who goes to church on Sunday. Do we see God's glory in it, or are we blind to it? Do we just use the 10,000 innovations we use every single day in a way that ignores God? And so I think that's really the challenge that we're up against, is that the church has sort of imbibed over time this idea that it's okay to just be God ignoring when it comes to technology. And we're trying to undo that and sort of reopen eyes to the generosity of what God has given us, even to do this recording. I mean, this recording right now requires amazing advances in cameras, computers, Wi-Fi, electricity. We're using all sorts of innovations right now. And the temptation is to just take it all for granted. Like, this is all just humans doing human stuff. And I think what God would say is he would break in and say, no, these are all gifts from me and my generosity, so that you can have this conversation, so the audience can watch and listen. Glorify me in the gifts that I've given you in my creation. And so that's really where the challenge is at, is trying to see God's generosity in it all.
Reminds me of the passage, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but my trust is in the Lord. It certainly fits in that regard.
Psalm 20, yep.
Yep, and I write out of that. And do you, how do you see like the story of the Tower of Babel impacting this idea?
Yeah, it's a great story. I think that's the default story that most people just go to. If you said, what does the Bible say about technology? It'd just be, let's go to Tower of Babel, and that's it. God is kind of aloof. He's kind of paying attention to his own things. And then every once in a while he looks back and says, oh, what are they doing? I got to step in and intervene. And I think a lot of people have kind of that worldview when it comes to technology, that God's kind of aloof. We're kind of doing these things. Are we messing each other up? Should we be doing SpaceX? Should we go into Mars? I don't know if we should be doing this, but eventually God will turn around and pay attention and come in and disrupt what he needs to. The Tower of Babel is actually a more complex story than that, in that what we see there is basically God wants 100,000 cities all over the globe. He doesn't just want one city. And so he steps in and he breaks up that one city in order to create 100,000 cities all across the world, the Tokyos, the Moscows, the Beijings. He wants to create cities all over the globe. And so he's not opposed to cities. He's not opposed to buildings. He's not opposed to building temples. All of those things, if we read the story wrongly, we'll think, well, God's opposed to all of those things, and he's not. He's opposed to humanity saying, we can construct a way of salvation that is godless. That's what he's against. And so the theory I put forward in my book is that the Tower of Babel is constructed with tar, waterproof tar, and stones because they expect that God is going to send another flood and trying to wash them away for their disobedience. And so they're trying to create a waterproof tower to get above the water. But God then comes in and does something really unforeseen, and that is he instills in them different languages. So he's going to create a plethora of languages. He's going to invent all the languages that we can think of all on that day. And that's going to spread the people across the globe to go build 100,000 cities all across the globe. And so I think this idea that God just was fed up with human technology, came down and squashed it, is kind of a misreading of the text, as is, I think, that idea that God is just sort of checked out and just looks back over his shoulder every once in a while to see what we're doing, seeing what kind of a mess we're getting ourselves into next. I think there's a lot of reasons to think that that story is not exactly saying what a lot of Christians think it says. And there's much more to the story, from Genesis chapter 4, from Cain's lineage, to Isaiah 28 and the farmers, Isaiah 54, the war weapons makers, and all the way on into Revelation 18 and Babylon. There's a huge story of human innovation that needs to be told along with that story in Genesis. So it's part of the story, but it's not the sum total of it.
Oh, I like that's some great insights there on the Tower of Babel story, and really just the idea of God wanting to expand to many. I guess part of the early in Genesis was to subdue the earth, to expand through all the whole earth and to multiply. So it makes a lot of sense in that regard. We've been looking at things kind of at a macro level, really, and you give some great hooks to think about and give us some good approaches to technology. I wonder if now we can kind of zero in a little bit more now on our own kind of personal lives, our own spiritual lives, and how technology has impacted our spiritual life in the 20th century, 21st century. Although I imagine we could go all the way back to things like the Gutenberg Press and see how that changed our spiritual life. What are your thoughts on how technology has, over the centuries, perhaps changed or impacted the way in which we worship and the way in which we live out our spiritual lives?
Yeah, that's a great perspective, because like when the Gutenberg Press came along and people could have Bibles, at first you could have a Bible in a parish, and then eventually each church could kind of have its own Bible. And then eventually, most, if not all, Western Christians can have a Bible. And if not, it's free online. Like it's an amazing opening of the word to God's people, which is just a huge blessing. That brings us with it challenges. Every time you have these sort of advances, that brings challenges, right? Like everybody can kind of go to the word and kind of come up with their own interpretation of what they think is right, because they have the text right there in front of them. And so it's not so easy as just, if you have a Bible in your hand, you're going to make the right interpretations or applications of the text in every case. And so, yeah, technology is always changing us. The question is whether it's changing us in a good way, whether it's making us more loving of God and more loving of others, or whether it's making us more self-centric, selfish, and things like that. And that's always been kind of one of the litmus tests we can bring to our technologies. Am I becoming a more loving person? I've talked with a lot of companies that are making AI, even in the Christian AI space. If you have a question, you just go into a chatbot, ask that chatbot your question, and you'll get a biblical response spit out. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with the AI move right now is just a misunderstanding of how spiritual formation happens, and the long process that it takes to actually grow as a Christian. A lot of it doesn't happen very quickly. And some of the tools make it seem like, if you have a challenge in your life, you're going to find an immediate fix, an immediate answer. Just go to the chatbot and find it. And that's just a misunderstanding of how spiritual formation works. It typically, God is going to send us through seasons of darkness, seasons of pain, seasons when there aren't a lot of answers. There's precious answers that you hold to, but a lot of answers that you won't find. There are seasons where God seems to withdraw from his own children. There is just times of pain that we work through with others. And that's kind of how he builds in us to be a people who are longing for his return. So it's not so easy as just finding a quick fix through AI, because it can spit out an immediate response to your question. The spiritual formation that we experience as Christians is a very different type of model. And so I think we have to be careful about what our expectations are with technology. Again, cognitively, we can do very impressive things. And with AI, it's going to get even more powerful. We can become more productive in our jobs. If the sort of forecasts of what AI tools to come prove to be true, each of us will be more productive in our jobs, especially if you have a knowledge job. But that doesn't change the fact that God works in us in his own agricultural pace by seasons, which is much slower. And so that's just one of the ways. And, in my book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, I kind of go through all of these different 12 ways that technology tries to make us think differently about the Christian life than we should. And so we just have to be careful when it comes to productivity, when it comes to the power of tools, that we don't come to think that the Christian life is easier, more simplified, or more streamlined than it really is. And so there's lots of cautions to keep in mind when it comes to incorporating technologies into our lives and having an awareness of what God is doing.
I really like that idea of the agricultural seasons of the spiritual life. Of course, you look at the Old Testament festivals, Passover during the Feast of Barley,
Yes.
Pentecost, the harvest of the wheat harvest, and Tabernacles, the end of the harvest season, and just how those all fit into God's plan and the cycles of a yearly life and our spiritual growth. And all the illustrations, of course, Jesus uses about seeds being planted and growing and multiplying. So it's a really helpful. Especially, and I guess maybe it's the wrong analogy. We say the microwave world in which we can nuke something.
Totally.
Probably something faster, I'm sure, today we could use rather than a microwave world. Just how quickly we can even make a phone call in an instant around the world. It's pretty amazing. What are some other ways then that you would see that things like cell phones might hinder our spiritual life in the way in which we use them in our families, our church, and our lives?
Yeah, if you go into your social media feed, typically what you're going to find is people that are like you, that think like you, that look like you, that are in the same socioeconomic grouping as you. That's typically kind of what we do, is we just find a lot of people that are like us and we follow them. And what the local church offers us is a place where we are hanging around people who are very different ages, different races, different socioeconomic classes, different gender, different, just all these different things. They all come together in this chorus of a community of faith that we need to hear from. Even the elderly and the disabled. Cognitive disabled Christians are not in my feed. I don't see them online. I don't hear them online. But they're at my local church. I see them, I hear them in my local church. And so God has put in our lives a whole spectrum of people that he wants us to learn from and grow from in the local church. And that's one of those areas where if you're just sticking to your feed, you're going to hear a lot of people saying the things that you want to hear and who look a lot like you, sound a lot like you. They're just, it's just very similar, and that's not healthy. And so that's one of those areas where we have to have the local church in order to encounter the different people in God's family. Similarly, that cognitive bias is very, very strong. So that everything I do online is my brain. How could I do this faster, do this more effective? It's just this focus on the cognitive capacity. When we're together with the people of God on Sunday mornings, there's no edit button. There's no meme. There's no fake image of me that I've created that I want you to see. Like, that is me unfiltered. Like, I am standing before you. And when we have a physical presence together in the local church, we sharpen one another, but we also come in a way that's less filtered. I wouldn't say it's totally unfiltered, but it's less filtered. It's more authentic. It's more who we are when we're in face-to-face communication with others. And that's how God intended us to be. He didn't intend us to just be brains in a vat. We are more than brains in a vat. And we see that in the embodied relationship in the local church. And that's why I say from birth to baptism to the Lord's Supper to the resurrection from the dead, we are more than just cognitive. We are soul, we are body, we are all of this together. And in the local church, we start to get more and more of a picture of what that looks like as being part of God's family that is very diverse.
Certainly, that's a sort of good admonition about why attending church on Zoom now is probably the best. Is it? Hey, we need to be in person and have that.
Yes.
The technology was nice, and it's nice when maybe you're out of town and I'd like to hear your be a part of your course, but it's very different than
for shut-ins who can't be there.
So the tools can be used for good, but there's the danger of over depending upon those technological tools. As far as when you think about the family, I know for teachers, parents, grandparents out there, many of us, we see our kids on their smartphones all the time. I think all of us have been to restaurants where you see families sitting down for dinner and they're all looking at their smartphones with no conversation. In your own life or in lives of others, have there been any, you might say, habits or disciplines that you found helpful to help families, help believers use technology in ways that are helpful, but also things that maybe set some boundaries or ways to avoid some of those dangers and the lack of interpersonal communication?
Yeah, my wife and I had the rule there was no smartphones at the dinner table, and so things like that can be really useful. Obviously, using things like covenant eyes, things that will have some eyes on what type of sources are being accessed through devices. I wrote a whole article on this early for Desiring God. I can't remember the title of it now, but where I laid out just a number of, if you search Desiring God's website, you'll be able to find 12 tips for parenting. It's an article that I wrote. It's got a different title. That's the subtitle. But I've got a bunch of different ideas there to help Christian parents kind of walk their kids through ages 3 to 16, kind of maybe tablet. Whenever you introduce a tablet, some parents are 3, some are 8. Like there's a huge debate on when, a child gets a tablet. Some parents are like never, and so you have that. But I try to help parents walk through the difference between parenting in the home with Wi-Fi versus parenting out of the home with a smartphone. And once you make that line in the sand and you move from, like a laptop in the home on Wi-Fi to a smartphone that can be used on the web outside the home, you give up a lot of controls. Now, there are parental controls that are better now than they were a number of years ago when I was a parent trying to figure this out. But basically, if you can help your child learn digital habits, good habits in the home, you can sort of discipline them within the home with a lot of control over what they see. You can use things like the Circle device is something that we used. It's a part of a wireless router that just cuts the connection to a device based on time limits or content limits. Very easy to control what your child sees in that context. Once you move to the smartphone, it becomes much more difficult, much more challenging. Your child needs to have some pretty clear history of being smart digitally, and you need to watch them for a number of years before you graduate to the smartphone. Unfortunately, a lot of parents nowadays outside the church just hand their 10-year-old smartphone, and that can be really a bad decision. So I've spent a number of years going around doing parenting seminars and giving the tools and the tricks to parents. And what I came to realize later on is that those tools and those tricks to prohibiting your child from seeing certain things online is sort of you're buying time for something else. Like that's not the end of parenting, is just making sure your kid doesn't see porn. The end of parenting is giving your child a vision, a vocational vision and a moral vision of their lives that is so compelling that they run towards that as the North Star of their life. And so, yes, set up limits, use covenant eyes, do all of those things on devices, on smartphones, limit what your kids can see, but see that as a buying of time that you need to set for your child, each child, a moral and vocational vision that's going to put their eyes up and higher beyond the drama in their high school relationships. You want to show them like college is coming. what's your major? What do you want to do in this world? What do you want to be? What do you want to accomplish? And if you can help your child set a vision of what they are to do vocationally and morally, the kind of person they want to be, you can build that into them from an early age. Once our kids got to like a freshman in high school, we tried to get them on college campuses just so they could see like, this is coming. This is, you could be at walking around MIT, like you could be at MIT. I mean, look at the computer labs here. Look at all the amazing research they're doing here. You could be here in 4 years. You got to watch the grades. You got to put in the time. And so what we were trying to do there, and we would buy the sweatshirts. They would have the swag, all through the high school years. They had college swag. What we were trying to do is just point their eyes past high school. Like, what's next? And I think that's where the really hard work of parenting happens. It's not just in the parental controls, it's in setting that vocational and moral vision for your child that's so compelling that moves them up and beyond sort of the drama and the allurements of what's online. And that's very hard. It's very hard, but you just simply can't fall back on the parental controls as being the end of what parenting is all about. That's not the end.
No, I really like that idea that the parental controls can be a helpful tool, but it's really more about casting vision. And in some ways, isn't it the gospel, difference between law and grace? And that the law shows us where we need help, but it's God's grace and goodness and His love for us that we respond to, and then move in the right direction. So that's a great thoughts there. In thinking about just the future of technology and its impact on the Christian faith, any thoughts on what's ahead for us as believers as we deal with technology?
Wow.
Loaded question, I suppose. Especially being, I know you're talking with ethicists. I mean, I'm sure there's just a whole boatload of things going on in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to watch for in the future. I think, early technologists thought that they could create a sort of a world in which God would be unnecessary. He would be so pushed back that we could take the reins of evolutionary progress, and even if there was a God, we wouldn't need him anymore. We would take the reins of evolution from him and say, okay, let's do this on our own from now. But what we've found is not a place where we are impervious to God's providence. Well, we find ourselves in a place of where technology actually makes us much more vulnerable than we thought we were. If you've ever had your identity stolen, you know how vulnerable you can feel in the tech age. And when it comes with nuclear saber rattling that we're seeing from Russia, you realize in a moment that the innovations that have been made and the advances in nuclear power, which I'm using right now to talk with you here in Phoenix, that same nuclear power has also created these incredibly dangerous missiles that can be threatening. And so you start to realize, like, there are amazing gifts in this, and we haven't buffered ourselves to the consequences of life. We have actually made ourselves more porous. And I believe I have a vision of God that kind of superintends the world as he sees it. I think we've been made more porous to his providence. We have not made him more distant. We have opened up our lives to new opportunities for him to sovereignly lead and guide as he sees fit according to his plan. And so I read an article the other day, which was really interesting about the move from the farm to the city was a move from everybody knowing your business. I'm from a small town. Everybody knows your business in a small town. To move to an urban center where nobody knows who you are, you can live as sort of an autonomous life. And now we have these technologies of AI facial recognition, where in the future, potentially we would have glasses, some sort of Google glasses where you could look around in the city and see people walking down the street and you would see their name and who they are. You get to see a summary of who they are. And so it's that breaking down of that anonymity that we thought we had in the urban setting is taking us back to a small town, everybody's in your business kind of feel. So it's not like that technology somehow is introducing a new phenomenon. It's reintroducing something that fleeing from the farm to the city we were trying to get away from. And so some of it is just a reversion back to older experiences that humans have had to deal with. So I think there's a lot of different things. I do think that there are lots of areas where we need new innovation to come in and to actually play a role in our everyday lives. I think we've gotten too focused on sort of digital media, AI, cameras, phones, EVs, things like that. I think there's a whole world of other things that we use every single day that can be improved and made better. Some of the things I'm looking for in the future are general use robots. A number of people say that's never going to happen. We're never going to have a robot, Rosie the robot, running around her house making beds and fixing meals and cleaning the dishes and things. But according to China, they are going to unleash in the next 2 years. They have a general use robot that they say will be able to do things in the home. Now, obviously, being China, we wouldn't want that in our homes. But they were on the leading edge of the Roomba and some of the vacuum robots and things. So who knows? Maybe we will see general use robots in the future. And what will that mean? There's a lot of unanswered questions about the future. But I think what I've tried to do in my book is to show, the new book is to show that God has given us technology as a gift. He allows certain things we make to actually work. And I believe he superintends everything that works by his sovereign power, so that we do not have to live lives of fear about what the future will look like, but we can rest in the one who gave us technology to know that he can govern it. If one of the themes that I saw throughout the Bible as I was writing this book is that if God is the first cause of the technology, you have nothing to worry about. If God is the first cause of the technology, you have nothing to worry about with that technology. That's one of the points of Isaiah 54:16. If God creates the weapons maker, who's not a believer, he is in sovereign control of the weapons that are made. That is mind-boggling. So we have to see God as the first cause of technology before we can trust in his providential grace over the future. And that's what I'm trying to help Christians get to, that place to see none of these technologies take God by surprise. Everything we make, he knew we were going to make, is there in the creation. Like, he gave us this sandbox. He gave us these Legos, this 50-gallon drum of Legos, and he knew exactly what we were going to do with it. Some things we were going to harm ourselves with, some things we were going to make our lives better with. But he knew it. He was sovereignly orchestrating all of that for us by his glory and his grace. And so if you see God as being the first cause of the technology in the world around you, you can trust in him that he will govern that for his glory. And so, but getting to that step is hard because it's very easy to just default to, let's be Luddites. Let's just say this is all of the devil. This is all of, it's all just humans doing human things. So we're just misusing the creation. We should all just live in one big garden. We shouldn't touch the uranium. We shouldn't touch nuclear fusion. We shouldn't touch fossil fuels. We shouldn't touch electricity. Just leave it all be. And I think that's a wrong approach to technology.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for really giving us a great overview of technology. I think really from a real biblical perspective, and this wonderful thoughts that God created this world and a place where we can explore and create and be technology creators, and that he is sovereign and in control of his providence, and that we don't need to fear. Obviously, we need to be wise, as you've mentioned, in the way we use technology. But so grateful for these words really of hope. We have a God who's working in and through technology and through our world. And as believers, we don't need to be fear-mongers, but rather just hopefully wise followers of Jesus Christ who continue to share the good news of God's grace and goodness on this earth and rejoice in these wonderful gifts of technology that he's given us. So thank you so much, Tony. Really appreciate this time that you've spent with us.
Amen. My joy. Happy to do it.
Well, I want to thank all of you for watching this broadcast. We're grateful to have wonderful speakers like Tony and writers, thinkers who have thought about important issues of our day. And so I encourage you to continue to check the C.S. Lewis Institute events page for upcoming events. And these events are made possible through the generous gifts of people like yourself. So I ask you to prayerfully consider making a gift to the work of the Institute in the days to come so we can continue to do works like this that hopefully will help us in thinking how to better articulate, defend, share, and live our faith in Jesus Christ, both in our personal and our public lives. Thank you, and may God bless you.